here with Mihiri Tillakaratne, and we are about to start this conversation about basically the Black Lives Matter, about this whole political movement, the protest, and also what's the relevance to Sri Lankans about this whole issue. So let me introduce Mihiri. And Mihiri, in fact, we met Mihiri when she was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she was doing her bachelor's at Harvard College. She did her bachelor's about I think, Asian Americans, probably. Is that the one that you did?
I did my bachelor's in history.
History.
And I minored in religion. Yeah.
Yeah, you did your bachelor's in history, and then you went on to do your master's in Asian American Studies at UCLA, where you wrote your thesis on Sri Lankan American Buddhist identity.
Yes.
And then you are also the founder of the Empower a Village, a non-profit organization, works with the rural communities in Sri Lanka. And presently you are pursuing your studies in PhD studies in ethnic studies at UC Berkeley. And you are continue to study on Sri Lankan Americans. And also you are teaching in the Asian American, in the Asian Diaspora Studies, and also in the Gender and Women's Studies department. So and then there's more to you. I just did a very brief introduction, and we'll talk a little bit more about you. So Mihiri, I'm happy that you are with us and talking about this issue. This is a little complicated issue, but we'll try it as much as possible to use these 30 minutes that we want to discuss this, how it is relevant to the Sri Lankan community.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me, Mr. Demel, and I hope that we have a really productive conversation.
Yes, sure. Let's do, and let me talk a little bit about what's this about. I know we all know this Black Lives Matter, the protest movement. I mean, it's not just started with this George Floyd's death, but I think it was before that. But it got a lot of prominence after this death, and I think also I know with that this statement he did, "I can't breathe," and all that. This get a lot of prominence, and also with that we know it came to the prominence, the police brutality, and also this oppression and the discrimination and all kinds of other issues that minority communities are going through. And I think although this happened in US, I think this can be relevant to all over the world, I guess, the people, especially the minority communities, and also with the police brutality and all that. So my first question, Mihiri, I mean, I asked this because I've heard that, I mean, I know with the protests are going, some Sri Lankans in US got involved and in many ways they got involved. Some they supported, some got involved with the protest. And then, but some said, this doesn't really, relevant to me because obviously this is about the protest about Black Americans and giving them some prominence and their rights and all that. So people sometimes ask the question, why it's relevant to me? What it means? What does that mean to me? I mean, kind of thing. So just very briefly tell why this Black Lives Matter movement or this protest or this whole the movement is important to Sri Lankan Americans in USA.
Mm-hmm. Well, first off, Black Lives Matter is relevant to everyone, regardless of race, whether you are minority or not. But for Sri Lankans in the US especially, we need to understand that that we are living in a country whose economy was built by slavery, was built by Black people since the 1600s. And the foundation of the country that we are living in, the US, is anti-Blackness. And what I mean by that is that throughout history, up to and including today, we see a disregard for Black people and Black life, and the idea that Black people are lesser or somehow lower than other human beings, and how Black people have been treated in the past has affected how other minorities, including Sri Lankan Americans, are viewed and treated today. And frankly, without Black people and others organizing and fighting during the civil rights movement, Sri Lankans who came to the US in the 1970s and later would not have the freedoms we have today. Sri Lankans would still be going to segregated schools, going to work on segregated buses, and using separate bathrooms. And sometimes I hear people responding that all lives matter, and they do. Saying Black Lives Matter is not saying that other lives are not important, right? Instead, what Black Lives Matter is saying is it's acknowledging how Black people in the US and in other countries are disproportionately targeted for violence and killed by authorities. So the Black Lives Matter movement, which started in 2013, after the death of a number of young Black men and boys like Trayvon Martin, and after the Ferguson protests, their mission statement says that Black Lives Matter is a response to state-sanctioned violence and anti-Black racism. So yes, all lives matter, but all lives will not matter until Black lives do matter and are acknowledged as worthy of life and freedoms.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. My question is, do you think, I mean, have this the involvement of the Sri Lankan Americans in USA in this movement or in protest, do you think you can be happy about that? Or
Yeah, I think we should be extremely happy and proud of Sri Lankan Americans who are involved in social justice and racial justice issues, especially our young people. They are intervening and questioning the social and racial hierarchies that exist in the US. We usually think of these hierarchies as fixed and unchangeable, but they can be changed. They have been changed before. And it actually inspires me to see so many Sri Lankan American young people going out and trying to make a difference. So for example, I've seen here in Los Angeles, Mihiri Tillakaratne started the Sri Lankan for Black Lives Matter Los Angeles group. And she and her cohort have been going to protests carrying Sri Lankans for Black Lives Matter signs. I know the Sri Lankan Youth Organization, which started here locally in Southern California and is now international. It was founded by Aruni Ganevatta. They've been going to protests and passing out snacks and water bottles to the protesters. They've been educating themselves through discussions. I know SLYO, the UK chapter, has been hosting discussions on racism and colorism. And actually last week, I gave a talk for the Sri Lankans for Black Lives Matter group here in Los Angeles. They have an educational series, and it sparked a lot of discussion and a lot of questions. And I've actually planned a follow-up informal conversation on Zoom later this week. So there is interest, and there are people who are galvanized at this particular moment. They want to learn, they want to know more, they want to do something. And I think we should encourage them to continue to do something. Because it is, like I said before, incredibly inspiring.
yeah, because the question I asked before is, I mean, I sometimes get this feeling, or sometimes talking with some people. Now, we know sometimes people, I'm talking about Sri Lankans in US as well as Sri Lankans in elsewhere. They say, well, when you talk about police brutality, they say, oh, that's not good. I think you have to do something and all that. But when the same thing happens sometimes in Sri Lanka, say the police brutality, people may not have the same kind of at least the way they talk about justice issues. So my question is, do you think, like, say, for example, can we say Tamil lives matter, Muslim lives matter in Sri Lanka? I mean, or when you say that if the same police brutality happens to a Tamil person or Muslim person, do you think the Sinhalese people will take the same stand like the white Americans did in the USA?
I mean, that's an extremely good question. And, obviously I do think like Tamil lives matter and Muslims lives matter, right? But it's complicated, and I think it is disingenuous to so race and these protests have a different meaning in the US than it does in Sri Lanka, right? Most of racism in the US is based on this black-white dichotomy or duality that doesn't necessarily exist in Sri Lanka. So I don't think that we can apply a US discussion of race and racism to Sri Lanka. But in Sri Lanka, there are many types of differences, right? There's ethnic, caste, regional differences, linguistic differences, religious differences. So, you know, I think what you're asking about is prejudice, which simply means having like preconceived notions about people. So for example, in my experience, you know, going to Sri Lanka, there are places in Sri Lanka where the majority of a particular population can be minority. So in places like Jaffna, they're mostly Tamil people there, right? And Muslims can be a majority in like certain places in the East. And then they can be prejudiced towards Sinhala people and say offensive things to Sinhala people. But when you consider the country of Sri Lanka as a whole, if a Tamil or Muslim person says something offensive to a Sinhala person, it is fundamentally different than if that Sinhala person says something to a Tamil or Muslim person. And that difference is in power and privilege. So the Sinhala person has more power and more privilege because they are in the majority of the country. And therefore they are protected and backed by state and government authority in ways that the Tamil or Muslim person is not. So like I said, I don't think we can exactly, it's not like a one-to-one thing where we can apply the situation in the US to the situation in Sri Lanka, because it's very complicated. Right? You have the history of civil war, you have a history of colonization, right, that we don't necessarily have in the United States. But there is similarities in the issues of power and privilege that we can try to unpack and really think about when it comes to the Sri Lankan context, and think about what are the dominant ideologies in Sri Lanka that have been used to uplift certain peoples and push down others. And that is, I think, a really important question to have, not only in Sri Lanka, but it's also a question or a conversation that I want to have with fellow Sri Lankan Americans here in the US. Yes.
Yeah.
I could go on, but I don't know.
I don't know, because I think you brought up a good point. I think you talk about this privilege. I think, I mean, I know in these racial conversations, we hear this white privilege, right? So, I know sometimes white people, they're not any fault of theirs, but they're born with some privileges, obviously. So in this, I saw some people in this protest, especially, say, well, we have to let go of white privileges and somehow be very conscious about some of these white privileges. Mm-hmm. Same way, I think what I'm hearing is maybe as Sinhalese, I'm a Sinhalese, you're a Sinhalese, we may have, when we go to Sri Lanka, we may have some Sinhalese privileges or Sinhalese Buddhist privileges. Maybe we have to be conscious about that, right?
Yeah, I think that's something that we really have to be cognizant of, that we have to keep in mind. And even here, Sri Lankans living in the US, I have encountered Sri Lankan Americans, right? People who were born here, or people who were born in Sri Lanka, who only define Sri Lanka as Sinhala and Buddhist, mm-hmm. right? When, as we know, there's a multiplicity of ethnicities and languages and religious communities in the country. And I've encountered some people who actually don't consider themselves a minority in the US because of the wealth, education, and privileges that they've had here. You know, I've talked to people and they've refused to acknowledge that they might have had a difficult time when they first immigrated, right? They say things like, I've never been discriminated against, right? Even if they came before the civil rights movement, right? They're like, oh, I've never encountered racism, which, you know, which may be true, there's a possibility, but it's definitely not a probability that that is true. So yes, keeping in mind our privileges and keeping in mind how we speak about Sri Lanka, especially in diaspora, is so important, where we need to be inclusive of minorities and also give them the space and the opportunity to speak, and not crowd out their voices. And the same thing when discussions of white privilege, it's the discussion of how to be a good ally. And really it is the opportunity to let people of color speak, but also leveraging your privilege as a white person, right? To intervene in moments when discrimination is happening, when someone is saying something racist, and say, you know what, this is not good, right? And push back against that. And I think, you know, Sinhala people in diaspora, Sinhala Buddhists, we need to intervene in moments when we see other people are being excluded and say, you know what, we have to give Tamil people, Muslim people, Malay people, you know, an opportunity to be a part of this conversation of what it means to be Sri Lankan in America, because they count too, they matter too.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, sometimes, you know, you have this identity crisis in a way, because, for example, say I'm a minority when I'm in USA, but if I go to Sri Lanka, I'm in the majority community. So, I mean, theoretically, I can be an oppressor and oppressed both in where I'm located, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think, yeah, it's complicated. It's very, very complicated, these issues of identity. And one thing that I've learned through my research over the past 10 years is that it is messy. It is so messy. We want to, I think, as an immigrant community in the US, we want to have these very sort of defined roles and defined ideas of what it means to be Sri Lankan, what it means to be American. We want to compartmentalize, but it's so much more complicated than that. And there are different moments where we have privilege, and there are different moments where we don't have privilege. And part of that is, it's a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, called intersectionality. And basically what that means is you have different identities that are layered on top of each other. So for example, you know, you have your race, you have your ethnicity, your nationality, your gender, sexuality, your class or economic privileges, but then also like legal status. So there's definitely a difference in your experiences based on the privileges that you have in one area you might not have in another arena, and that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think
Discussions.
that's a good way to get into this. Just a little bit discussion about this immigration in the USA, because they talk about legal situation. Because we know, I mean, I know sometimes we have this debate, especially right now. We are hearing this debate is getting, I think, more vocal with the election coming in USA as well. Sometimes even, you know, I hear the Sri Lankans say that, Sri Lankan Americans say, well, you know, it's good that what President Trump is doing, you know, he's trying to restrict, and we have to send all these illegal immigrants, we have to deport them, or we have to have the wall, I mean, whatever. Sometimes we kind of tend to forget that we also, as immigrants, we have come in a different ways, I mean, all that. Can you say, I mean, based on all this, in the context of this racial, you know, all these heated debates, what do you think about this immigration situation?
Well, I mean, it's complicated, but first off, America is a country of immigrants, right? So for the Trump administration to obstruct immigration or stop immigration in any way is frankly against American ideals. I'll just say that. And for some Sri Lankans, you know, who were born in Sri Lanka and immigrated to the US, it seems like to me that they came here, they were allowed into the US, and now they want to shut the door after themselves, right? So I actually know a Sri Lankan who was sponsored to come here to the US by his family. He's now living and working here. And he's a Trump supporter, and he's against social welfare programs, even though he and his family directly benefit from those very programs. So I think it's part of the maybe that minority majority thinking. Maybe I don't know. I don't know why he thinks that way. And in conversation with him, it wasn't productive and it wasn't fruitful. But yes, I think that some people just don't understand what it is the Trump administration is doing, and the implications for how that will affect the future of the United States. So, for example, there's been a lot of legal exclusion in the past in the United States. So, in 1882, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that excluded all people from China, specifically Chinese folks. And then there were multiple immigration acts in 1917 and 1924. So Asian people essentially were only allowed in very, very, very small amounts. Like there were just exceptions, handfuls here and there, until about 1943. And even then, the quota was increased to only about 105 people per year who were allowed to come in, until we got the Immigration Acts of 1952 and 1965, which opened up immigration. And now you have this like beautiful, diverse community that's here. And most Sri Lankans who are living in the US right now have benefited from the opening of that immigration. So if we go back to a time where only, let's say, 100 or less than 100 Sri Lankan people are able to come to America, can you imagine what that would look like for our future and for the future of people like me who are born and raised here, for my generation's children and their children, how that's going to affect how they think of themselves as Sri Lankan and American, right? I think it's a very narrow way of thinking, and I think it doesn't consider the long-term effects of what these immigration, what the potential immigration plans are. But I hope that we can all agree, regardless of our political affiliations, that children should not be separated from their parents and they should not be put in cages. So I hope that regardless of what you think about, I know probably people who are watching could be Trump supporters as well, but I hope that you have some empathy for the people who are being separated from their children and the children who are being separated from their parents. Because that's also a very important issue that we should consider. It's still ongoing. It's still happening, and these children and their parents are going through a lot of trauma right now as a result of the Trump administration's policies.
Yeah, that's true. I think this country was built on those values. I think I especially try to welcome strangers and all these other values. I think. So I hope that will continue those traditions. I mean, I know we can talk a lot, but I just want to touch one other thing before we end our conversation, because I know although we talk about racial issues, I think even this country has come very far from gender issues, homophobic, and all these other discriminatory issues. What can you say about, based on this whole conversation we are having this on racial justice and all that? What are the other areas that the country needs to move forward and get just at least to see that we are all equals? That is somehow have that kind of understanding among each other.
So just to clarify, you mean like the U.S. in general, or do you mean specific Sri Lankans?
Let's talk about U.S. in general. I mean, yeah.
Okay. So first off, I think that we need to understand that issues of racism, sexism, homophobia, classism are all interconnected, right? You have they're all interconnected, and therefore the solutions need to consider this interconnection. So for example, let's say you have a Black queer teen, like a Black transgender teenager, right, has been kicked out of their home for being transgender. And that teen is homeless. So that isn't an issue of just homelessness, right? that teen not only needs, well, they are a minor, right? So that's social services, right? Children and welfare services. They are homeless, so there's the homelessness issue, which people might see as the main issue, right? They need support as a member of the LGBTQA community, and they also need support as a Black person, right? So an issue that, you know, someone sees someone sleeping on the street and says, oh, they're homeless, why don't they just get a job? Right? You know, I hear that sometimes, but that's not the case. It's a much more complicated issue. So having a kind of expansive view on these issues and seeing how they connect and they influence each other are really important. And something that is particularly relevant to Sri Lankans in the US is, you know, the question of status, right? So some people are undocumented. Some people have come on the green card lottery, right? But they only have a high school education coming from Sri Lanka. And some people come here for, you know, educational, professional reasons, right? And therefore they have different privileges that they bring with them, right? And we call ourselves all Sri Lankan Americans, and we consider ourselves all to have the same experience. But the way that someone who has a full US citizenship versus someone who's undocumented versus someone who's on the green card lottery, they are moving through the world in different ways. And if we have to consider issues of Sri Lankan Americans, we have to consider a wider range of issues, whether it's status, gender, you know, sexuality, all of these things we have to consider if we want to, you know, progress as a community.
Yeah, that's true. I think we need to have a larger, bigger conversation about these things. I know the time's not enough for us to have that conversation, but I'm very happy that we discussed some important issues and relevant to Sri Lankan community, not only to the Sri Lankan community in US, but also to the Sri Lankan diaspora, as well as people living in Sri Lanka. Mm-hmm. And one thing I'm very proud that you are very articulate and you understand what these issues and you're in a, you know, I think as a young Sri Lankan American, we have to be proud of how the way you are articulating this your point of view. And I think especially because I mean, sometimes that's when you hear these kind of views, we have a lot of hope about not only about this country but about the Sri Lankan Americans, and you know, that maybe they will, because I think sometimes we wonder, like when you see, of course, this some other nations, the people who come here, they are getting into politics, they are getting into big places, but sometimes for us, there's some kind of this lacking that we don't see many people getting involved into these positions, the political officers running not that much, but all that. But what I'm trying to say is, I think we need to encourage and to have this kind of more conversations about these issues. I mean, we cannot. Like you said, there may be people who may not agree with what you say, but I think it's important that you say what you believe. I think that's important. So
thank you. Yeah, actually, you know, there are plenty of Sri Lankan Americans who are politically involved, you know, who are working for local government and who are working in social justice. Mm-hmm. And there's some truth that some Sri Lankans who may not have been born or raised in the US may not have been involved. But the thing is, some people just don't know. You know, they're so busy living their lives and trying to survive that they just don't have the time to talk or think about, you know, the history of social justice in the US. And some people didn't learn about things like the civil rights movement in school, right? Because they went to school in Sri Lanka. So I think that, you know, it's understandable why some people might not be as politically involved, but there is some hope for people who were born and raised in Sri Lanka. So after the death of George Floyd, Venerable Dr. Valpulapiyananda from the Dharma Vijaya Buddhist Vihara in Los Angeles put out a public statement. So he said, those people in positions of power should not abuse their power, but use it to promote understanding through communication and generate mutual respect, which I think is a great message. And then you have the Sri Lanka Express, which is another a national newspaper, across the US, I mean, but which is run by Hasina Tillakaratne, who is in Southern California. Again, born and raised in Sri Lanka. And she writes about issues that are relevant to Asian Americans, like the protests, like the current US Census and social justice. And with the Sri Lankans for Black Lives Matter group, there were plenty of folks who were born and raised in Sri Lanka, but who are now living in the US, who are members and who joined my presentation last week. It was so great. So there definitely is hope for people. I think this is a moment that has galvanized a lot of people that haven't necessarily been involved in these issues before. And I think we need to, support them and encourage them, despite the fact that they might not have like certain knowledge about historical and social justice issues, but we need to encourage that and foster that so we can create like a wider awareness in our communities.
That's true. That's true. And at least you can use this as a learning moment for all of us, right?
Yes.
So Mihiri, thank you so much. And maybe we'll have another conversation at sometime or some other time. And again,
yes,
thank
I
you
would
so
like
much
that.
for your time. And hopefully, we had good discussion, and hopefully this will generate more conversation. And
oh, I hope so. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay. Okay, all the best, Mihiri. Keep doing what you're doing, and okay, good luck.
All right, thank you very much.
Welcome. Okay, bye.